I used to weigh 325 pounds, and my wife, Emily, who had lost a few close friends to heart attacks, was deeply worried about my health. In hindsight, I can't blame her for being concerned, but the way she handled it still stings. She came up with this deal where our intimacy would be limited to 4 times a year, tied to weight loss milestones. She picked Valentine's Day, our anniversary, and our birthdays as the only times we'd share those moments, assuming I hit the target she set. At the time, I went along with it, thinking it was for my own good. Over 2 years, I worked harder than I ever thought possible and managed to drop down to 207 pounds, losing a staggering 118 pounds along the way. But honestly, I was exhausted. I was ready to stop. That's when everything fell apart. When I told Emily I wanted to quit, she didn't just say no, she dropped a bombshell. She flat out told me that if I gave up the diet, the intimacy would stay restricted to 4 times a year, and if necessary, she'd find fulfillment elsewhere. I couldn't believe my ears. Her words hit me like a slap across the face, leaving me in shock and disbelief. I looked up at her, searching for some sign that she didn't mean it, but all I saw was someone who had already decided that her needs came first. Sadness quickly turned to anger. I realized, right then, that the foundation of our marriage wasn't just cracking, it was shattering. How could she dangle intimacy like a carrot in front of me, only to threaten infidelity when I told her I couldn't keep going? The weight loss wasn't just about me anymore. It felt like I was a pawn in her twisted game. I confronted her. I told her exactly how much effort I had put into losing over 100 pounds, just for her, and accused her of using our relationship as a tool to manipulate me. What did I get in return, Emily? More deprivation? And now you're talking about finding someone else. The words came out like venom. Her face dropped as I went on. You've destroyed what we had. You've made me question everything. Whether I can trust you, whether I ever could. Emily tried to explain, stammering out something about how she didn't mean it, that she'd never actually cheat on me. But I wasn't buying it. Her words felt hollow, like they were meant to placate me rather than repair the damage. I left the kitchen table without another word, heading to the garage to clear my head. Sitting there, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't really think she had been unfaithful during the past 2 years, but her threat planted a seed of doubt in my mind. Earlier that morning, I would have sworn on anything that Emily would never cheat on me. Now, I wasn't sure anymore. Worse, I didn't know if she would cheat in the future. I spoke out loud, as if hearing my own voice would bring clarity. I need to find out. When I finally walked back inside, Emily was still sitting at the kitchen table, her face red and tear-streaked. Part of me felt sorry for her, but I was too hurt to show it. I told her flat out that I was done with the diet. From now on, I said we'd stick to her original 4 times a year rule, or maybe even less. I left the decision up to her. And then I warned her. If she ever sought intimacy outside of our marriage, the consequences would be severe. I meant every word. I told her that if she ever cheated, it would be the end of us. No second chances. No excuses. Grabbing my keys, I walked out into the garage again. I needed air. As I drove away, I heard her faint sobbing through the open window. She was muttering something, probably to herself, but I didn't care enough to ask. Later that afternoon, when I came home, she was lying in bed in the same miserable position I'd left her in. I didn't bother waking her. Instead, I decided to get to the bottom of things. I drove to our phone providers to request call logs for both the landline and her cell phone. Both were in my name, so I didn't face any trouble getting what I needed. I paid for 3 years' worth of records. It wasn't cheap, but I figured it was worth every penny to uncover the truth. Back home, I locked myself in the office and started analyzing the data. It was slow work, but I was determined. I began with September 2008, the month I started dieting, and Emily imposed her restrictions. I compiled lists of every number she called, the dates, times, and durations of each call. The process took hours, but I felt like I was finally taking control. As I was about to start on her cell phone records, I heard the doorknob rattle. Quickly, I saved my work and stashed away the evidence before opening the door. There she was, my wife, standing there in a mess of tears, her face red and swollen. She barely looked at me at first, but when she did, her eyes were full of remorse. She apologized over and over, admitting how selfish and cruel her actions had been. She acknowledged how much I had sacrificed for her and how her words had driven a wedge between us. I listened, but deep down, I wasn't ready to forgive her. She had broken something between us, and I didn't know if it could ever be fixed. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at Emily as she apologized with tears streaming down her face. She was pleading for my forgiveness, acknowledging that she had overstepped, that I should have been the one to decide whether or not to continue the diet. Her words felt genuine. She sounded like she truly regretted what she had said, but the damage was already done. It wasn't just her apology I needed. I needed answers. I needed clarity. I told her I forgave her, but it wasn't unconditional. Emily, I said, I'm forgiving you based on what I know right now. I love you, I always have, but you've pushed me to my breaking point. I gave up so much for you over the last 2 years. My comfort, my time, even intimacy, and now I find myself questioning everything. That's not fair. I paused, gathering my thoughts, and continued, we've got a gorilla in the room, and we're not just going to sweep it under the rug. I need to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, whether or not you've been faithful to me. I can't live with this uncertainty. It'll drive me insane. Emily nodded slowly, tears spilling down her face, and whispered, I haven't cheated on you, Jason. I swear I haven't. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the doubt was there, planted firmly in my mind, thanks to her hasty comment and the threat she had made. You're going to have to live with the consequences of what you said, I told her. It's not going to be easy for me to trust you again. Her face fell even further, and she turned and walked dejectedly back to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. I stayed in the kitchen for a while, staring into space, before finally deciding to head out. I wasn't going to sit around and stew in my emotions. I drove to Grisham's, the little place Emily and I had visited countless times before. The food was great, and tonight I needed comfort food. I ordered a bacon cheeseburger, greasy and loaded with everything I'd avoided for the past 2 years, along with a couple of beers. I sat there, eating and thinking. My heart felt like it was breaking in two, but I wasn't going to let it show. When I got back home, Emily was still in the bedroom. I didn't disturb her. Instead, I went straight to my office and got back to work on the call logs I had requested earlier. With the home phone data finished, I turned my attention to her cell phone records. I sorted and organized the information, working quickly since I was already familiar with the process. By the time I was done, I had a full picture. Over the last 2 years, there had been 3,482 calls from a total of 45 numbers. Most of them were normal, calls to me, our parents, her sisters, and some friends we both knew. But 2 numbers stood out. One had over 200 calls, and another had over 50. I didn't recognize either of them. That's when I dug deeper. I sorted the calls by date and time, and what I found sent chills down my spine. The first number was called every Wednesday at 11:05 a.m., 10 minutes after Emily would call me at 10:55 a.m. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. On Wednesdays, I had a standing meeting at a restaurant with my boss and other department heads. I wasn't reachable, and Emily knew it. The second number? Those calls were made on Friday afternoons, once a month. On those days, I played golf with my brother and our friends, always returning home around 6:30 p.m. after finishing our round and having a drink at the clubhouse. Emily would always call me before I teed off, saying how much she loved me and that she'd be waiting when I got home. Now, I had to wonder, was she just covering her tracks? I extended my investigation, pulling data from before the diet started. What I found hit me like a ton of bricks. The same patterns had been happening for 3 months before she imposed her restrictions on intimacy. Whatever was going on, it hadn't just started, it had been in motion for a while. I needed to know more. Using a reverse lookup, I found that the second number was listed to Tony Bali. That name made my blood boil. Tony was my trainer, the one Emily had found for me when I first started the diet. It made too much sense, but I still needed to confirm. I headed back to Grisham's and sat at the bar, nursing another beer. When things quieted down, I approached Brenda, the bartender. I explained the situation in vague terms and asked for her help. I gave her the first number and asked her to call it, pretending to be a potential client. She agreed, playing the role of a young woman interested in hiring a trainer. Brenda dialed the number and asked for Tony. Sure enough, it was him. She even got him to admit that he had an opening because a client had recently quit. As I sat there listening to her conversation, everything clicked into place. Tony wasn't just Emily's trainer. He was her secret. The anger I felt in that moment was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. My suspicions were confirmed, but I still didn't have all the answers. How long had this been going on? How deep did it run? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? As I drove home, one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As I sat there in Grisham's bar, nursing another beer and reflecting on everything that had unfolded, I couldn't help but feel utterly humiliated. Emily had already tipped Tony off. That client he mentioned losing? That was me. She had warned him to be careful, because I was on to them. The thought of her protecting him, even after everything, made my stomach churn. Brenda, the bartender who had helped confirm Tony's identity earlier, gave me a sympathetic smile. She had been a bright spot in this dark mess, cracking a joke about how she didn't need to lose a single pound because she was perfect as is. I smiled back and told her she didn't need to change a thing. She was stunning. I'm in it too. She was exactly the kind of woman who didn't need someone like Tony to validate her. Brenda's laugh was infectious, but her words hit deeper than I expected. You're a catch, you know, she said. I don't understand why your wife would go looking for someone else. I forced a smile and replied, 2 years ago, I wasn't exactly a catch. But even then, it doesn't excuse what she's done. I thank Brenda for helping me uncover the truth and for boosting my confidence a little in the process. Before I left, I made a mental note to return someday, if only to repay her kindness. When I got home, it was late, so I headed straight to bed. Crawling under the covers, I glanced at Emily lying there, and a wave of sadness and loss washed over me. When I climbed in, she stirred slightly and whispered, I love you, Jason. I grunted in response, too emotionally drained to say anything back. Turning away, I stared at the wall, trying to force myself to sleep. I thought I heard her let out a quiet sob, but I didn't turn to look. Eventually, exhaustion took over. The next morning, I woke to find Emily spooned against me, her body pressing into my back. It felt so familiar, yet so foreign now. Sensing my arousal, she reached around and touched me, her voice soft and full of regret. Jason, she whispered, I'm sorry for everything. I want us to be close again. I pulled away, heart aching but firm. Emily, we've been over this. The boundaries are clear. Don't try this again. Without waiting for a response, I got up, showered, and headed to work. I needed to be anywhere but there. At work, I confided in my boss about what was happening. I gave him a brief overview, omitting the grittier details, and he was incredibly supportive. He even suggested taking some time off to sort things out. When I mentioned my need for surveillance equipment, he gave me a lead on a reputable electronics distributor and even called ahead to ensure I'd get what I needed. Later that day, I picked up 3 high-end listening devices. They were compact, had long battery lives, and could transmit over a significant range. I was nervous but resolute. This was my chance to get undeniable proof. At home, Emily had made my favorite dinner, lasagna with garlic bread and sweet green peas. She was trying so hard to fix things, but I wasn't ready to forgive, let alone forget. I thanked her for the meal, but excused myself to the TV room. Later that night, after she went to bed, I planted one of the bugs on our home phone and another on her cell. It was quick work, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing I was finally in control. The next step was Tony. I knew this was riskier, but I couldn't leave any stone unturned. I remembered that Tony trained a blonde woman at the gym on Wednesday mornings, so I planned to take advantage of his distraction. At 10:50 a.m., I slipped into the gym and spotted his phone sitting on a towel. My heart pounded as I snatched it and slipped into the men's room. Installing the bug took only seconds, but getting the phone back onto the towel was the tricky part. I decided to slide the phone across the floor, hoping it would land close enough without raising suspicion. It hit the towel with a thud and slid underneath, perfectly positioned. Tony, engrossed in his client, didn't even notice. Relieved, I left the gym just as my phone rang. It was Emily, calling at her usual time to check in before my meeting. Little did she know I was off work for the rest of the week. Later, From the safety of my car, I began monitoring the bugs. Tony's phone rang, and I heard him greet Emily. My stomach turned as their conversation unfolded. Emily expressed concern, saying I was suspicious and they might need to pause their meetings. Tony grumbled, clearly unhappy with the idea, but Emily reassured him she would figure something out. Then came the bombshell. Emily admitted that the first time she and Tony had been intimate, she knew she'd do anything to be with him. She revealed that cutting me off physically had been a way to enhance her time with Tony. She even joked that while she loved me, she couldn't risk losing Tony. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Over 2.5 years of betrayal. Every Wednesday, every Friday, I played golf over 100 times. She had used my weight loss as a cover, a way to justify the distance between us while giving herself to him. I couldn't even process the depth of the betrayal. All I knew was that I couldn't let this slide. My love for Emily had been real, but her actions proved she didn't deserve it. The pain I felt was giving way to anger, and as I drove home, I began devising a plan. This wasn't just going to end with a confrontation. There would be consequences for both of them. Emily had no idea what was coming, but one thing was certain. I was done being her fool. I sat in silence, watching the events of the afternoon unfold. It was surreal, seeing everything I had suspected come to light, with evidence I had worked tirelessly to gather. Sarah's facade was crumbling, and I was finally in control of a situation that had robbed me of peace for far too long. It started with the doorbell. Sarah, hesitant and still on edge from our recent confrontations, opened it to find Brenda standing there. Brenda, cool as ever, introduced herself as a friend of mine and explained that I had invited her to enjoy the pool. Sarah, clearly unsettled but unsure how to refuse, reluctantly showed Brenda to the backyard. As Brenda walked out, I noticed her subtle, knowing smile. She was enjoying this moment more than I expected. Not long after, Sally and Linda arrived. Both women Sarah vaguely knew through me. Sally had worked with me for years, and Linda had been our server at Grisham's more times than I could count. They made it clear they had also been invited by me. Sarah, now visibly uncomfortable, was forced to host these 3 women in her own home, all while her guilt loomed like a storm cloud over her head. The women wasted no time making themselves comfortable, lounging by the pool and applying sunscreen with carefree smiles. They chatted and laughed, the tension in the air almost palpable as Sarah watched them from a distance. Brenda, ever bold, struck up a conversation with Sarah, and I caught snippets of what was being said. She wasted no time cutting to the chase, explaining that she knew everything about Sarah's ultimatum, about Tony, and about my suspicions. What struck me was Brenda's calm, yet cutting delivery. She told Sarah outright that I was investigating her and that I had warned her of the consequences if infidelity was confirmed. Brenda even revealed my plan to repay Sarah's betrayals by indulging in carnal relationships with each of them for every instance of cheating or lying. Watching Sarah's face pale at this revelation brought me no joy, only a grim sense of justice. Sally and Linda joined Brenda soon after, each sharing their admiration for me in ways that were as flattering as they were surreal. Sally admitted she'd had a crush on me for years, even when I was overweight, and Linda spoke openly about fantasizing about being in Sarah's position. I listened quietly, letting their words settle over the moment. For the first time in years, I felt valued, not for what I could give, but simply for who I was. At precisely 4 p.m., I walked out onto the pool deck, where Sarah sat stiffly, the 3 women now fully at ease. I greeted everyone casually, making playful comments about their tans, and even teasing Sarah about not joining in. Her discomfort was palpable, and though part of me wanted to let her off the hook, I knew I couldn't. I turned to her, my tone serious now, and asked, "Sarah, have you ever cheated on me during our marriage?" Her denial was swift and firm, but I pressed on. "What about Tony? You know, from the gym? Wednesday mornings, Friday afternoons?" Her face betrayed her shock as she stammered out another denial. I saw the panic in her eyes and knew she was clinging to the hope that I didn't have concrete proof. But I did. I laid out everything I had gathered: the phone logs, the the patterns of calls, and even Brenda's confirmation of Tony's number. Though I lacked physical evidence, the consistency of the calls and their timing painted a damning picture. Sarah's silence said it all. She realized I wasn't bluffing. The weight of her betrayal was now fully visible, and I could see her trying to find a way out. But there was none. My anger and hurt overpowered any lingering love I had for her in that moment. I introduced Brenda, Sally, and Linda, explaining their connections to me and their interest in pursuing something more. Each woman spoke openly, sharing their admiration for me, and I couldn't help but notice how their words contrasted sharply with Sarah's recent behavior. They saw value in me, something Sarah had disregarded for years. Finally, Brenda, ever the practical one, pulled divorce papers from her bag and handed them to Sarah. I hadn't expected that, but it felt right. Brenda explained that she had connections through her bartending job and had taken the liberty of drafting the papers. Sarah, now on the verge of a breakdown, stared at the documents as tears streamed down her face. "I'm done, Sarah," I said, my voice steady but resolute. "I've given you everything, my love, my loyalty, my effort, and you threw it all away. I can't do this anymore. You've made your choices, and now I'm making mine." Sarah tried to respond, but I stopped her. "There's nothing you can say to fix this. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed the trust and love we built together. And I can't come back from that." I stood there, watching her crumble under the weight of her own actions. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by the clarity of knowing I was finally free. Free to move on, free to rebuild my life, and free to be with someone who truly valued me. As I left the pool deck, I heard Brenda say softly, "You brought this on yourself, Sarah." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. As I stood by the pool watching Sarah crumble under the weight of her own actions, I knew there was no turning back. Brenda had just served her the divorce papers, revealing herself not only as a bartender, but also a process server. The sight of Sarah breaking down in tears stirred a mix of emotions in me: pain, anger, and, oddly enough, relief. It was time to end the charade. When Sarah started pleading, I listened silently. She apologized again and again, claiming she loved me and begging me to reconsider. But her words meant nothing now. I couldn't reconcile her declarations of love with her actions over the past 2 years. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm but firm, "if this was about a mistake, maybe I could find it in me to forgive you. But we're talking about over 100 times. 100 times you chose someone else over me. That's not love. That's selfishness." I told her the court hearing was scheduled for next Friday, and after the legal separation, I intended to explore relationships with Brenda, Sally, and Linda. I wasn't shy about admitting it. I wanted to understand why she found satisfaction in betraying me. Maybe in some twisted way, it would help me heal or at least find closure. After dismissing the women, I headed inside to pack a few belongings. The hotel would be my home until Friday, when one of us would officially move out. I needed space to breathe and process everything. As I walked back outside, suitcase in hand, I found Sarah still sitting by the pool, softly crying. I placed my bag down and approached her. There was one final thing I needed to say. "You know," I began, "Tony isn't the man you thought he was. While you were canceling on him yesterday, he was already warming up to that blonde coworker of his. Gina Margarella, wasn't it?" I paused, watching the realization sink in. Turns out Gina's husband, Gino, wasn't too thrilled about Tony's extracurricular activities. I continued. "Let's just say Tony's not going to be making anyone happy anytime soon." I didn't elaborate on my role in ensuring that outcome, but I knew Sarah understood. Tony's broken ribs, missing teeth, and ruined reputation were the least he deserved. I let the weight of my words hang in the air before picking up my bag again. "I hope you have a great life, Sarah," I said simply. "I'll see you in court." By the time I reached the hotel, I felt drained but resolute. The following week was a blur of legal meetings and quiet moments of reflection. Sarah, I heard, moved in with her mother, leaving behind the life we had built together. The divorce process dragged on for 7 months, each day pulling me further from the pain and closer to acceptance. As for the three women who had stood by me that day, I ultimately decided against pursuing any romantic entanglements. Brenda's kindness, Sally's admiration, and Linda's support meant the world to me, but I realized I wasn't ready. Instead, I found solace in simpler things. Two golden retrievers who gave me the unconditional love I thought I'd lost forever. The journey was long and difficult, but in the end, I discovered something far more valuable than revenge or fleeting connections. I found peace, self-worth, and a renewed sense of what love truly means. After everything that had happened, I needed clarity. My doubts about Sarah had taken root and grown into a gnawing suspicion I couldn't shake. The only way forward was to gather evidence. I started with the phone providers, requesting detailed call logs for both our landline and Sarah's cell phone. Both accounts were in my name, so I didn't expect any issues, and I was right. The landline company gave me 3 years' worth of records on a CD for a small fee, which I gladly paid. I wanted to go back far enough to see if there were any patterns or behaviors that predated the diet. Next, I visited the cell phone provider. They hesitated at first, probably because it was Sarah's number I was asking about, but I pointed out that it was a joint account, with my name prominently listed. They finally agreed, though it cost me $120 to get the data electronically. I made a mental note to consider switching providers in the future. When I got home around 4 p.m., Sarah was lying on the bed, fast asleep. She looked exhausted, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I reminded myself why I was doing this. Quietly, I went to the office, locked the door, and started downloading the data from the CDs onto my computer. I knew exactly how to tackle this. I decided to start with the month I began the diet, September 2008, when Sarah had restricted our intimacy to 4 times a year. It took me about an hour and a half to compile a list of all the numbers dialed from the home phone in that first month. 96 calls to 19 different numbers. I sorted the data by number, date, time, and duration. Once I figured out the system, it was easy to expand the list to cover the last 2 years. Just as I was about to move on to Sarah's cell phone logs, I heard the office doorknob rattle. My heart jumped. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I quickly saved my work, stashed everything, and opened the door. There she was, disheveled, red-eyed, and sniffling. She looked like a shadow of herself, reluctant to even meet my gaze. "Jason," she started, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry. I know I hurt you. I've been so selfish, and I see that now. Please, can we fix this?" Her words felt hollow, but I listened anyway. She apologized profusely, admitting she'd overstepped by tying our intimacy to my diet. She begged me to forgive her, claiming she never intended for things to spiral out of control. I told her the truth. "Sarah, I can't just let this go. You've broken something between us, and I need to know if you've been honest with me, if you've been faithful. Until I'm sure, there's no way forward." Her face fell, and she nodded slowly before retreating to the bedroom. I heard her close the door, and moments later, her muffled sobs. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but the anger and betrayal were too raw. Later that evening, I drove to Grisham's, the bar where I had first confided in Brenda. I ordered a greasy bacon cheeseburger, something I hadn't allowed myself in 2 years, and a couple of beers. It felt like a small rebellion against the life I'd been living, a reminder that I still had control over my choices. When I returned home, I went back to the office and finished analyzing Sarah's cell phone data. With both sets of logs combined, I had a clear picture: 3,482 calls to 45 different numbers over 2 years. Most were perfectly normal calls to me, our parents, her sisters, and a few friends I recognized. But 2 numbers stood out. One had over 200 calls, and the other had more than 50. Digging deeper, I sorted the calls by day and time. That's when the pattern emerged. Every Wednesday at 11:05 a.m., right after Sarah's weekly check-in call to me, a call was made to the first number. And on Fridays, once a month, there were calls to the second number, always in the afternoon when I was out golfing. The consistency was too perfect to be a coincidence. My stomach churned as I pieced it all together. On Wednesdays, I was in a staff meeting, unreachable. On Fridays, I was out with my brother and friends. These were her windows of opportunity. When I traced the first number, it came back unlisted, but the second was tied to none other than Tony, her gym trainer. It all clicked into place. Tony wasn't just her trainer. He was her affair partner. The calls, the timing, the way she had pushed me away, emotionally and physically, it all made sense now. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling with anger. The betrayal was worse than I'd imagined. Sarah hadn't just hurt me. She had orchestrated an elaborate lie, using my efforts to improve myself as a cover for her selfishness. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I had the evidence I needed, but it didn't bring the relief I'd hoped for. Instead, it left me with one burning question. How could she claim to love me while doing this? As I sat there at Grisham's, nursing my beer and digesting the revelations about Sarah and Tony, the pieces started falling into place. Brenda had just confirmed my suspicions. Tony, the trainer Sarah had suggested for me, was the one she'd been sneaking around with. It was infuriating and humiliating to think that she had essentially orchestrated this betrayal right under my nose. Brenda's playful banter brought a small reprieve to my thoughts. When I joked about her needing to stay far away from Tony, she laughed and said, "Trust me, Mark, I don't need Tony, and frankly, you're quite the catch yourself." I gave her a wry smile. 2 years ago, I wasn't exactly a catch. But it still doesn't excuse what Sarah did. Brenda shook her head. "Doesn't matter. You're a good man, and any woman with half a brain would see that." Her words boosted my spirits more than I expected. I thanked her for everything. Her help with confirming Tony's identity, her support, and even her kindness in lifting my battered ego. Then, with a heavy heart, I headed home. When I got back, the house was quiet. It was late, and I went straight to bed. Crawling under the covers, I looked at Sarah, lying there, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest, a mix of loss, betrayal, and disappointment. She stirred slightly and whispered, "I love you, Mark." Her words felt hollow, a cruel reminder of the lie I had been living. I grunted in response and turned away, unable to muster anything else. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind churned through everything I had discovered, and I was certain I heard a quiet sob or two from Sarah. But I couldn't bring myself to care. In the morning, I woke to find her spooned against me, her body pressing into mine. She reached around, touching me in a way that had once brought comfort, but now only stirred conflict. "Jason," she whispered, "I'm sorry. Let's move past this. I miss us." I pulled away, fighting the temptation to give in. "Sarah, we've already talked about this. The boundaries are clear. Don't do this again." Her face fell, but I didn't wait for her reply. I got up, showered, and left for work. At the office, I confided in my boss. I kept the details vague, but explained enough for him to understand that I needed time to address some serious personal issues. To my relief, he was incredibly supportive and even gave me the name of a reputable electronics distributor for surveillance equipment. Grateful for his understanding, I let him know I'd be taking the next few days off. The electronics store was everything I needed. With my boss's recommendation, they were ready to help, and I left with 3 high-end recording devices, discreet, powerful, and with a range that would easily cover our house and nearby areas. When I got home, Sarah had made my favorite dinner, lasagna with garlic bread and sweet green peas. It was a thoughtful gesture, but I couldn't bring myself to see it as more than an attempt to smooth things over. I thanked her, ate quietly, and then retreated to the living room to watch TV. Sarah joined me, but kept her distance, clearly trying not to push too hard. Later that night, after Sarah went to bed, I got to work. I planted one bug on the home phone and another on her cell phone. It was nerve-wracking, but it had to be done. I needed the truth. The final step was the riskiest, bugging Tony's phone. I knew he trained a well-built blonde woman on Wednesday mornings, and I figured it would be my best chance to get close without being noticed. The next morning, I arrived at the gym and spotted Tony's phone sitting on a towel near where he was working with the blonde. My heart raced as I approached, thinking, what the hell do I have to lose? I snatched the phone and slipped into the men's room. Installing the bug was easy. It only took a few seconds. Getting the phone back to the towel was trickier. I couldn't just walk up and place it there without being seen, so I decided to slide it across the floor. It made a faint noise, but Tony was too engrossed with his client to notice. The phone hit the towel and slid underneath, exactly as I'd hoped. Back in my car, I began monitoring the bugs. It didn't take long for Tony's phone to ring, and when he answered, it was Sarah on the other end. Hearing her voice sent a wave of nausea through me, but I forced myself to listen. She sounded cautious, telling Tony that I was suspicious and they might need to cool things down for a while. Tony wasn't thrilled, but agreed to her suggestion. Then came the gut punch. Sarah admitted that their first encounter had made her realize she'd do anything to keep seeing him. She admitted cutting me off to make their time together more fulfilling. The rage I felt was like nothing I'd ever experienced. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Over 2 years of betrayal, meticulously hidden behind lies and manipulation. And Tony, he wasn't just her trainer. He was her accomplice in this elaborate charade. I drove home, numb with anger and disbelief. My love for Sarah had been real, but now it felt like a cruel joke. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not yet. I couldn't believe how low I felt, but the bug I planted in Tony's phone had already begun to pay off. Listening to Sarah's conversations was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Horrifying, but impossible to turn away from. Every word was another punch to the gut. When she told Tony she'd cut me off to make their time together more enjoyable, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. By Friday, I was running on pure adrenaline. I listened as Sarah called her beautician, discussing her plans to distract me with a new look and provocative lingerie. Her laughter over temporarily reducing her encounters with Tony cut deeper than I could have imagined. She saw it all as a game, while I was drowning in the reality of her betrayal. Then came Saturday. I had set my plan into motion, and it began when Brenda showed up at our door. Sarah looked surprised, but let her in when Brenda mentioned I'd invited her to use the pool. Brenda's confidence was palpable, and as she strolled past Sarah toward the backyard, I caught the subtle smirk on her face. She knew exactly what she was doing. Not long after, Sally and Linda arrived, each carrying a bag of pool essentials. Sarah looked even more uncomfortable as they explained how they knew me. Sally is a longtime co-worker and Linda from our frequent visits to Grisham's. Watching Sarah squirm was strangely satisfying. She was clearly unsettled by the presence of 3 beautiful women lounging by the pool, applying sunscreen to each other, and eventually removing their bikini tops for an even tan. She wanted to ask them to leave, but she knew better than to risk pushing me further. At 3:30 p.m., Brenda approached Sarah, sitting down beside her with the kind of calm confidence that could unsettle anyone. I could see Sarah's discomfort from across the yard as Brenda began to speak. She didn't hold back, explaining how I had confided in her about Sarah's ultimatum and my suspicions of infidelity. She even told Sarah outright that I was investigating her and warned of the consequences if my suspicions were confirmed. Brenda's words were sharp, but what struck me most was the way Sarah reacted. Not with denial, but with silence. She looked startled and defensive, but she didn't argue. Then Brenda dropped the real bombshell. If I discovered infidelity, I intended to explore relationships with the 3 women present, with one condition: each instance of betrayal would warrant a deeper connection. Brenda added, almost mockingly, that Sarah's lies would only add to the count. Sally and Linda soon joined the conversation, each sharing their admiration for me. Sally admitted she had always found me sweet and attractive, even before my weight loss, and Linda openly expressed her fantasies about being in Sarah's position. Their words weren't just flattery. They were validations I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. At precisely 4 p.m., I stepped onto the pool deck. Sarah's unease was obvious, but I kept my tone light as I greeted the women and complimented their tans. I even joked about their beautiful bodies, a dig I knew would get under Sarah's skin. When I playfully asked why she hadn't joined in, she reluctantly complied, her discomfort almost tangible. Then I turned to Sarah with the questions I'd been holding on to for days. Sarah, have you ever cheated on me during our marriage? Her denial was immediate and firm, but I pressed further. What about Tony? Wednesdays, Fridays, his house. Ring any bells? Her shock was evident, but she doubled down on her denials, insisting she had no idea what I was talking about. It was almost impressive how committed she was to the lie, even as I laid out the evidence. The phone logs, the timing of the calls, the patterns I'd uncovered. Brenda even chimed in, confirming that the number belonged to Tony. Sarah's silence spoke volumes. She was cornered, and she knew it. There's nothing you can say to convince me otherwise, I told her. Your actions over the past 2.5 years speak for themselves. I introduced the women one by one, explaining their connections to me and their interest in pursuing relationships. Brenda, with her sharp wit and empathy, Sally, with her years of admiration, and Linda, with her candid affection. Each of them had shown me more respect and kindness in one afternoon than Sarah had in years. Finally, I turned back to Sarah. I'm done, I said, my voice steady. I gave you everything, my trust, my love, my loyalty, and you threw it all away. You don't deserve me. Sarah didn't respond, tears streaming down her face as she realized the gravity of her actions. I felt a pang of sadness, but quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about reclaiming my life. As I walked back inside, leaving Sarah to face the weight of her choices, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. It wasn't happiness, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. As I stood by the pool, I couldn't ignore Sarah's desperate tears. She was falling apart, but the damage was already done, and there was no undoing it. I had spent years believing in a love that turned out to be hollow, and now, all I could feel was a mix of hurt, anger, and determination. She continued to deny everything, even when I confronted her directly about Tony. She stuck to her story, feigning confusion and shock. But the evidence I had collected painted a very different picture. Sarah, I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. You can deny it all you want, but the facts don't lie. You've been meeting Tony on Wednesdays and Fridays, consistently for over 2 years. Hundreds of calls, perfectly timed, and all leading back to him. I might not have pictures, but I don't need them to see what's been going on. Her face crumbled as the weight of my words settled over her. Still, she remained silent, her tears flowing freely now. Brenda, Sally, and Linda, sitting nearby, watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't malice. They just knew the truth was finally out. I turned to the women and introduced them one by one. Sally, I said, is someone I've worked with for years. She's always been kind, sweet, and supportive. She's had a crush on me for a long time, but she respected my marriage too much to ever act on it. Sally smiled, a little shyly, but her eyes held warmth. It was a stark contrast to the cold distance I now felt from Sarah. And Linda, I continued, has admired me for years, even before I lost the weight. She's seen how I've treated you, Sarah, how much I've given to this marriage, and she's told me more than once how lucky she thinks you are. Linda's gaze was steady, her admiration clear. It was strange, almost overwhelming, to feel so valued after everything I'd been through. Finally, I introduced Brenda. Brenda's new in my life, but she's shown me more empathy in a few weeks than I've felt in years. She's been honest, compassionate, and incredibly helpful. Brenda gave Sarah a pointed look as she pulled a folder from her bag. I'm also a process server, she said coolly, handing Sarah the divorce papers. Consider yourself served. Sarah broke down completely, sobbing as she clutched the papers. Between gasps, she tried to plead with me. Jason, please. I'm sorry. I love you. Don't do this. I shook my head, my voice firm but calm. Love? If you loved me, Sarah, you wouldn't have betrayed me over 100 times. This isn't just about a few mistakes. This is a pattern, one that shows no regard for me, my feelings, or our marriage. The court date was set for next Friday. I had already decided to leave the house until then, so I went inside to pack a few belongings. When I returned to the patio, Sarah was still sitting by the pool, now crying softly. Before I left, I leaned down and said, "Oh, and about Tony? Turns out, when you canceled on him, he found comfort in Gina Margarella. You know, the blonde coworker he warmed up with before meeting you. Funny thing is, her husband Gino didn't take too kindly to that. I watched Sarah's face twist in confusion and fear as I continued. Let's just say Tony's days of training women are over. Gino made sure of that. And yes, I got my own shot in. Consider it justice. For me, and for every other husband he's wronged. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She knew there was nothing left to say. The next few days were a blur. I stayed at a hotel, quietly preparing for the legal proceedings while Sarah moved out and went to her mother's house. By the time we met in court, the tears were gone, replaced by a hollow silence. The divorce process took 7 months, during which Sarah spiraled into a deep depression. I didn't wish her harm, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy either. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. As for me, I decided against pursuing anything with Brenda, Sally, or Linda. They had been supportive and kind, but I realized I needed time to heal. Instead, I found solace in 2 golden retrievers who brought me the unconditional love I thought I'd never find again. Through them, I discovered something far more meaningful than revenge or fleeting relationships. Peace. And with it came the realization that I didn't need Sarah or anyone else to feel whole. I had finally found love, true, unconditional love in the simplest of places.